brought up that you wanted to talk about taxonomy last week, and we didn't get to it last week, and I put it on the list for this week if we can get to it now. We'll see. Okay, let's jump in.
Great. So this is kind of the documentation review. There's not a show and tell today because I didn't want to blindside anyone, because what we've been working on is it started as we'd collated a bunch of issues that people had raised with the documentation, some of them purely technical or aesthetic regarding there's tables breaking out, and some in some places that was an open question about whether particular bits of documentation or guidance which had been carried through from previous versions of HSDS was still either still relevant or even or just wrong, and they might have just been invalid and might not have been caught when bringing these through. So I collated all these issues, and then for each individual one, it opened up further questions on, well, what should we be doing? So for example, with there was an issue around these tables breaking out, and we could just fix that with CSS. But really, we should be providing worked examples in JSON, and then so it kind of opened up these kind of larger questions. And every time I kind of went to solve an individual issue, it resulted in, well, actually, we would need this in place to do it properly. So we kind of wrapped it all up in this kind of larger documentation review, and I'm in the final stages of getting it ready for comment. So I think by close of business Friday UK time, there will be a branch of the docs live, and I'll probably open a pull request just to give everyone something to point towards. I've kind of went through and reorganized a bunch of the documentation so that there's a very clear delineation between this is canonical normative reference documentation, this is non-normative more guidance things where we've got a bit more flexibility to respond to user need agilely, and I have tightened up some of the ambiguity that was in the documentation before, some of which was carried is fine, but just while I was in there, it was easier to, for example, the schemas require that the ID properties are formatted as UUIDs. So rather than just relying rather than just saying that, I've linked to the RFC defining what a UUID is. So really just kind of trying to iron out all those bits of ambiguity. And there are a few things which which were implicit, which I have tried to make explicit based on my understanding of our agreed kind of implicit assumptions. So, and David might have an opinion on this, but for example, the profiles mechanism, it was ambiguous as to whether the instructions for that should live in normative reference or whether they should be guidance, because technically speaking, the example profile and the HSDS schema tools, they're separate artifacts which can be governed separately to the standard. So I went a level up and I defined a specification for what a valid and conformant profile would be, matching the implementation that we've already got. So that technically speaking, if for whatever reason open data services collapsed or disappeared, or we all fell under a bus, then you have a specification there that you could take to anyone and they could re-implement different tools that would conform and be compatible with what we've already got. So it's kind of like opening that space up and kind of really kind of separating the concerns so that HSDS defines what a profile is. But now we've also got a reference implementation that people can either just take and use or base their own implementations off. So that was quite fun. So yeah, this is more like an FYI heads up. This is coming on Friday, and some of the things in the menu have been reorganized a little bit. So don't panic about the lack of a logical model page. It's still there. The content is all still there. It's just being put into the overview and model section so that there is hopefully a flow of reference that kind of all builds upon each other if somebody was to read it back to front, but it's all kind of been clearly labeled and interlinked. And the other major change is that since Mike and the OR UK team were absolutely on fire with getting their profile up and ready before we'd done the documentation review, I have excised the Open Referral UK compliance page. And then instead we've got a link to the known profiles, which links directly to Mike's documentation there. So we've got a nice clean separation and people can just be referred off to that. So yeah, there were, if people fundamentally disagree with some of the things that's in there, that's absolutely fine. It's a first stab at kind of formalizing some things that we've had implicit and trying to clarify some things. I've included lots of worked examples in for all the guidance stuff, which are available in both JSON format and tabular data package format examples as well, using some of the nice documentation features that we've got, like tabs and stuff. So hopefully it's nice and comprehensive and not too overwhelming for people looking at it. And we're very open to different ways of doing things. But we've got something that we're quite pleased with. And I'm going away on leave next week, so you've got an entire week at least where I'm not around, where you can just have at it and tear it apart. But I think it's really up to the community to decide how long you want to review it, and then at what point it's going to be ready for merging in. But yeah, so hopefully nothing controversial. Everything's still valid and conformant. It's still HSDS 3.0. We've not accidentally done a version update, so it should hopefully be all okay.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions? Okay, great. A couple of things came up along the way for next steps. I want to check with you all, gut check with you all on this. I don't think we have to figure this out right now, but this set of design principles for HSDS that I just pasted in the chat, this harkens back to 2014, when our reference point for HSDS was actually the general transit feed specification from Google, which is 3 CSV files. And I just wanted to check in our framing of the principles behind the design of HSDS, whether we think these principles are still our principles. And I think for most of them, that is the case. We're still about factuality and provenance. But I wonder whether we can honestly say that simplicity is a value that guides the design of HSDS at this point. I think we've made a variety of choices that are not simple because our users needed more complex specifications. And but that one in particular, I wanted to check whether we still think that actually simplicity is still guiding our complex efforts, or whether there's a better value that we can express there, or whether maybe we should just simply drop that value. I'm pretty sure factuality, fidelity, and provenance and accessibility are still our values and still important. But I figured I would check with you all on this. Quick thoughts. This is also something we could kick to the summit.
Oh, I think it's good for the summit, but I think that fidelity nicely counterbalances simplicity. This is my gut. It's nice to have simplicity as a factor, because otherwise things can spiral.
Do you think that we can? Do you think with the spec as it is, we can say with a straight face that simplicity is a design principle that we've taken here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay.
I mean, it's
cool.
not linked data or RDF, so I
That's
think
right.
we're fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Version 3 has some simplifications over version 2.
Okay. All right.
Agreed.
I'm conscious that I always promote it as terms of providing more information than you could get from a Google search, essentially, in a structured way, and I don't know if we've picked that up completely. So it's kind of comprehensiveness there.
Okay.
But it's simple because a lot of that is optional, but
yeah,
it has the power which you'd never get from a Google search.
Yeah, I mean, I would be able to, given that frame, I would be able to defend that value, even if just on the basis of like the required fields that we ask for are very simple, right? And the formatting that we're looking for is, all things considered, despite the fact that it's like serialized and so forth, the formatting is still intended to be simple. I just wanted to do a gut check. I'm going to leave the question open. We don't have to spend more time on it now. But I would welcome your reactions if you take a look at the design principles and have any thoughts. We do want to open that question about whether those should be revisited. But I'm glad to hear that you actually think we're still in alignment with our formative principles. I'm also flagging. I think this might be something we want to potentially address in the summit or simply table for future meetings. But we've also noted that the use cases documentation is still a little thin. I think we do have material elsewhere that we could bring in. Right now, the use cases, it sort of references our types of users, and we do have personas under project documentation. I think that gives a little bit, types of use and user personas gives a little bit more context. But that's types of use. Yeah, like this page gives a little more context, but this is something that we flagged. We might want to further articulate the use cases that we expect for HSDS. And I'm just opening that. We don't have to spend time discussing it, but would welcome any suggestions you might have for how we might improve that part of the documentation next.
I can write my own use case and just contribute that.
If you have a use case for HSDS that is not specified in here, then yes, we definitely want to hear about it. So, okay, great. Okay, so Matt, do you want to quickly talk us through the profile documentation and tooling situation? And I think that probably verges into Mike's update. Any update from Mike, and we can sort of tackle this. Maybe we can tackle this in about 10 minutes or less.
Yeah, I think I can give you, if somebody starts a 2-minute timer, I think I can keep myself within that. And this is a really good that David's here actually, because he can either tell me off if we've misinterpreted or not. So basically, we ate our own dog food regarding the profile documentation, and we helped Mike generate his profile documentation kind of in-house here at Open Data Services. So we kind of took the profile that him and Dom had been working on and kind of ran it through our documentation tools in order to get him his ERD diagrams, his schema, his API documentation automatically generated, which, as you know, have been integrated into the example profile repo. And we straight away came up with a problem, and that the ERD diagram moaned that there was a bunch of keys that weren't there. And so I went away and investigated why. And at first, we thought there was a bug in the conversion to the data package tool. So HSDS schema tools provides a function which you point it at a folder of schemas, like the HSDS schemas, and it will generate the data package.json file, which would describe the tabular serialization for HSDS. So at first I thought there was a bug in that, and I kind of went to our internal development team, and then Ben, who's a very clever boy, went away and investigated it and said, oh, actually, it probably isn't a bug, it's just undocumented intended behavior. So the bugs that we were in, or what we thought was a bug that we were encountering, was if you added a new property in your profile and then compiled all the schemas, it wouldn't appear in the ERD diagram for some reason. So the ERD diagram is built from the data package.json file, which should be representative of your profile. But there is a requirement that you add this special constraints property in the JSON schema in order to have that picked up. We're not sure if it's strictly necessary, but we think it's intended behavior as a way of supporting that data package representation directly from within the JSON schema. So if that concurs with David's understanding, that's great. And then the second problem we had was that it was moaning that it didn't have a foreign key, so it couldn't draw this relationship between this foreign key, which had been labeled in the data package, but which didn't exist in this kind of tables list of properties that it was getting. And the reason for that is if you remove a relationship, like a one-to-many relationship, you should do it from both directions, because David's tooling was quite robust in that it looked at both directions of the relationship in order to make that data package and say, okay, well, that's a foreign key going to be over there. I'll go back and add it. So what we're going to do is just basically iron out that documentation, and to make sure that people don't fall into the same trap that we let Mike fall into with OR UK. So we know more about how the tooling works now, and we've spotted the problem, and we're kind of on top of fixing it. But it was just in case anybody was working on a secret profile of their own right now. This is something you need to be aware of, and hopefully it should be represented in the profile documentation soon. I'd just like to check in with David to make sure that understanding was correct, or whether we've misinterpreted.
I think that's all right. I knew the ERD diagram was going to be more complicated than just like making it work because of those things, and I didn't work through all the. That's why I hadn't done it yet, because I knew there was going to be like these edge cases. But I was hoping that, I forgot with the constraints. Probably it does make sense that they need to. I think that makes sense, and what you've done is fine. I don't think it would take much dev work to make it work, but if you got it working now.
So our understanding is if we just create an addition in the JSON schema. So if you're in your profile, you're in the profiles folder, you're defining your changes. If you add a new property, it has to have a constraints property within that in the JSON schema, which kind of is picked up by the tooling and then generates and adds that property to the data package.
That's right. You're going to need to do that for any new fields that weren't. Especially for the new fields that weren't there. For constraining, it probably is okay, but if you've got new fields that weren't there,
so if you go, like if one goes away and looks at the canonical HSDS 3.0 schemas, they've all got this constraints property. Most of them just declare that it doesn't need to be unique. But I think the takeaway is for the data package to be generated properly, profiles just need to be aware of this as a requirement. So what we're going to do to respond to this is just update the documentation to make it very explicit that this is how it's intended to work.
Or we could update the tooling to not need it if we didn't actually think we needed it or not. But
I think that's probably something to consider over the medium or the long term, depending on if it's a valid technical. If it's valid to remove that restriction that it needs that property, but in the short term, this is how it works. So we should tell people that, I think, is the take.
So do we want to and Matt, what's the question that we want to try to land on for this for now?
I think it's less of a question, more of an FYI, and just if there was a question, it would be in the context of the current documentation review, should we be noting that within the HSDS docs, or is it sufficient to note that as part of the expanded, here's how to use this example profile repository README that we've set up already? I'm erring towards the latter because it's a bit less labor intensive, and that's where most of the here's how you go about doing this stuff is already, and I prefer not to split that across two different locations. But if people have strong opinions to the contrary, we're very open to that as well.
Insofar as I've understood, and I may not have understood everything, Dom did our work. Firstly, we've not added fields to the UK profile. We've just constrained what's there. So we shouldn't have come across the first problem. But I think documentation explaining what should be done is probably sufficient, though in an ideal world it would automate it. And the second point, I think it is good that trying to generate an ERD will throw up any lack of referential integrity. So that, it was good that we found that in an ideal world, that would be reported as an error when you try and generate the ERD, rather than just having documentation saying you haven't done it right, try again. But that as long as the documentation says that we should look out for those things, that's fine. And it's a feature rather than a bug that you can't generate an ERD from a structure that isn't correct.
Yeah, to be clear, the code that attempts to generate the ERD, it does flag up that there's been an error doing that, and it stops you building it. And so if somebody's used to debugging that type of stack trace, it will tell you what's wrong. It's just we didn't understand why that was a problem, and now we do. So we can, as part of the documentation, we can say if you get this error, this is refer to this. This is what's going on, and be aware of that.
Okay.
I think the one.
Go ahead.
The one thing we discussed earlier, Greg, was just how much of a priority it's going to be, given that we've kind of used a lot of our time, or all of our time, on the profile work stream, and whether it's there's any requirement for this in the short term, medium term. I mean, it'd be good to get it done, but if people aren't going to be using profiles or data packages within profiles anytime soon, then maybe that time could be better spent elsewhere, I think is the question.
So I think it's important that the data packages are technically supported, but I have not heard from anybody who's saying like we need to continue using data packages. I want to put that question to Skylar and Devin to see whether you all have a sense of like anybody in the state side who's using data packages and needs that support, but I'm not aware of any.
I'm not within my little circle of users, but my users are more enterprisey, so that doesn't surprise me.
Okay, so what I would say is, Matt, let's move forward with what you think is the right and also expedient approach. Let's share an update in the forum that includes a sort of signal that for data packages, this kind of support is not going to come, be built in, and that we want to hear from someone in that forum message. We'll just say we want to hear from you if that poses a problem. All right. Okay, Mike, you want to quickly talk us through anything there is to know about the UK profile, and then I'll want to ask you all some questions about the blog post.
Yeah, with Open Data Services assistance, we have generated that UK profile. We got one outstanding issue with Matt that we were discussing before we started. I've done a post about it. We've generated with Read the Docs of the documentation, and we're giving them their $5 a month to remove the adverts, and we've put that at a subdomain of the Open Referral UK site. We'll need some tidying up in the long run. I've separately emailed about a dozen different developers in the UK that are using or intend to use the standard and saying, can you move in due course to the new one? I am nervous that they will raise issues, and the only response I've had is I need time to get my head around this. So I think issues are yet to come, but I'm hoping we will get one or two and then we can follow it up. And obviously, we've talked at prior meetings about the validator and the dashboard, and only can we just genuinely ensure that people are implementing the new profile if we have the validator against it. There's other work going on in the UK, which is quite interesting, with our Department for Local Government, finally having picked up that there's a need to mainstream the standard. That's just beginning and will take place over the next 3 months. But I'm hoping that will result in some commitment to resourcing the standard going on, being mainstreamed. But that's, that will take a few months to take effect. But obviously, I want to get to a point where people genuinely are compliant, rather than, as our biggest supplier is just saying at the moment, we've kind of aligned with the standard, which is not the same as being compliant with it. That's the company in the UK that says it's got 70% of the market for local government service directories is releasing a statement that it's compliant. So I've told them this is what compliant will mean if you move to the new version. But the devil is in them actually implementing, and I foresee issues, but we've got as far as we can for now. And I've reviewed your blog, which I'm really like Greg, but others may have comments. Thanks.
Right on. First, any questions for Mike? Okay. And yeah, Mike, I'll want your input on the blog post. So, folks, I shared a link to the blog post draft, and I'll want some input also from Dan and maybe David. Like, I've got a draft basically talking about the why we've done this, and then referencing the UK's example, and I'll include links. But what I'd like is like a paragraph that summarizes like briefly the tech stuff that a non-technical person would skim over, but a technical person would be like, okay, I understand the gist. And I could look at the documentation and try to pull something out myself, but if you like, I'd welcome your input as to what you'd want sort of a general audience to know about this implementation. And I'm going to also draw something up about like examples of other potential opportunities to put this into practice. But if somebody else has suggestions for what else you think the world should know about this profile mechanism that we've developed over the last 3 or 6 months, please let me know. It's long enough as it is, but I'd welcome any other suggestions for how we should sell this to the community.
I mean, if our audience is people who want to apply their own profiles for particular use cases, I think it's largely sufficient. And you've said that we can constrain and we can add fields and we can constrain to taxonomies.
Yeah.
I would almost leave it at that and not complicate it.
Right.
It's almost a separate post. This is ODSC's technique for profiling. Isn't it wonderful? If you want to do something similar with other standards, this would be how to do it. But I don't think that's our audience at present.
Right. Okay. All right. So we don't have to spend much more time, but you have the link. And if anybody does have any suggestions for other messaging around this, let me know. Okay.
Just on that, I think, I don't know if you meant to say me and Matt, but Matt and I will take a look at that technical stuff and we can put something together, and whether we use it or not is,
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just looking for the basics of a little bit of a technical introduction of what this is, right? How you go about it, what you do. Okay.
Some other potential use cases might be valid. So even if when you're not going to do it, if Skylar or Devin or Atticus thinks, when the time comes, we could apply this to 211 or whatever, then that might be something that's worth adding a para on.
Yeah, I mean, 211 I do expect that to be happening, but because that's not a process that I control, we will blog about that when the time comes.
Right, but I don't think it would do any harm to say this is a process that is suitable for things such as a 211 profile.
Yes, I will think about. Yes, I will think about how to.
I'd like that, because I'll take it back to the accelerator group and be like, "Hey guys, look, Open Referral is definitely about to support you, so let's get this done."
Yeah. I'll think about how to frame that in a way. Maybe not calling out 211 by name, but saying like sector-specific industry associations or that sort of thing can essentially set the standard for their subdomain. Okay. So the rest of our time we can spend talking about potential new business with an eye towards the forum. I think the forum is not meant to really get necessarily into the technical minutia, although, if folks really have something new that they want to talk about there, like Devin, the taxonomy topic is definitely something that I think we can carve out space for. The schedule table is not necessarily something I'd expect, us to be talking about during the summit, unless, although I do expect there will be potentially, especially if we hear from people that we want it, a sort of a time set aside for like 3.1 and beyond, right? To talk about like what's on our backlog. So we could have that time if you want, but I see a couple of technical stuff, and then we can check in on setting the agenda for the summit and any other matters pertaining to the summit questions you have and suggestions for me. Any questions or suggestions, or we just want to go through and hear from Devin and Skylar on these issues? Okay. Devin, I think Skylar's might have been very specific, and maybe you just wanted to start a broader conversation. So maybe we should hear from Skylar first about the schedule and URL issues.
Sure.
Okay, Skylar, take it away.
Yeah, these are very specific and brief. So we're working with the 211 Accelerator Group with an eye towards a profile. We're working with a national data platform, kind of taking a leading role in that. And so we're looking at data from across every major INR system in the US. And we discovered that the current HSDS schedule table doesn't really work for representing that data. It's great for representing recurring like events and things, and I think that's kind of the issue. It's a little more geared towards events. In terms of schedule, it's very close. I convinced the national data platform to parse things out in something very similar to this, where we're saying, look, we're going to define the start time, open close times, and then put the days that applies to in there. So if you have a couple different ones, then you have a couple different records, and you have to put them together and say, Monday through Wednesday is 9 to 5, but Friday is, 8 to 5 or something. So they're fine with that. The only difficulty is that then you have two different descriptions. You have a description for each of those, but the data that we're getting universally, and it's partly an issue of data quality on the INR side, has one description for everything. And so we're not able to represent that, hey, here's the, the source data that this is derived from, or here's a plain text description that's intended to be surfaced where machine readable stuff isn't necessary, or we're not able to do it. We basically have to add a description to each one of those. And if I put the description out on those two separate records I just created, then I've kind of defeated the purpose of normalization. I'm duplicating that. Further, when there's more than one schedule active, it can be a little tricky knowing which sets of open close times go together. And we have quite a large number of use cases where there's multiple schedules. It's sometimes active at the same time. So you can't just look at what time of year is this active to try to figure that out. So what the NDP did is take basically this table schema and nested it, because they're thinking in terms of JSON, under, I think they called it time. They're calling what we have currently just the times, and then nesting it under a table called schedule. And schedule just has that global description, and then a nested array of those hours. So they're basically saying, here's multiple schedules, and then here's those blocks of normalized hours that apply for each one. And as well as that source data, that source description that kind of represents this whole block of times. It made a lot of sense to me. It was adopted by the group. So this is a point where the accelerator group is pointedly out of spec and is going to remain so, just because of the nature of what they actually have to work with as source data. And I'll be creating a forum post recommending that maybe we consider, a similar kind of adoption in future. And it's a longer term thing, that's fine. But it definitely, I concur that I think what they came up with represents scheduled data a little better and intuitively than the current table. So that's that one.
So first of all, did anybody have any clarifying questions for Skylar about what we heard?
Yeah, I'd like to wondering how are they handling scenarios where services are open, say, every other week or every other
recurring events, which is why we adopted the framework that we did. Are they just they just don't care about it?
That data still exists in the hours table. So it's for organizational purposes. The current schema works pretty good. They just need the ability to group records at one level above. So they added an abstraction layer that says I have multiple schedules attached to a resource.
Okay.
And each one has one description. And I need that description to get used across a collection of hours records, of current schedule records. Does that make sense?
I think so. Like my initial approach was to like attributes to do that. So all of them have got the same attribute with a description, even though that breaks the attributes table. Then you could all link them to the same description because every table has got an attribute. That's how I would have done it without sort of breaking compatibility. But that's a slight breakage of what the attribute table's for, but it would have worked in a similar way.
Can we do that without breaking the spec? Because I can take that suggestion back. See if
I think you can, yeah. I think the attributes table will end up having lots of attributes with some text in for the description. That's like an attribute of description for all of them, but they can all link to the same description. They'll have the same ID and or the same description ID. Yeah, they should.
It's certainly going to be a bit of a complex bit of code to still parse out all those schedules that belong together.
Yeah, I think it's like probably more natural for the system to do it the way they did it, but that seems
right.
Yeah.
But in other words, there could be a way that we could translate between these without having essentially a fork.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's bring this back to the forum for now.
Okay.
You know, I'm tentatively optimistic that we can figure this out. Because yeah, the recurring events that are non-weekly, essentially, that's why we adopted this more complex version, because we heard from a lot of different folks that they needed it.
Yeah, and it's working. I want to emphasize that they didn't change like the hours table they concocted is this. So they kept that.
Cool. And Skylar, I want to follow up with you about that process, but we can follow up offline about that. So
okay. So URL table is something I think has been looming on my mind for a while, and then I've just started having clients and the use cases actually cross my desk in the past couple of weeks. We have data sets now where they have multiple URLs for a service, and so we need to be able to store all of those. And they're being like, we're going to tag it with Facebook and website and X, and comment eliminate them with tags inside the URL field. And I was like, no, don't do that. That's not machine readable. Please don't do that. This happens to be the first client is with a fairly progressive INR. The INR is going to pop a repeater field in there for URLs. Essentially put it out to a separate table. So I think that a URL table, the same way that we have a normalized phone table, is something to consider.
Okay. This sounds like it belongs in a GitHub issue, if there's not already an issue thread about it.
Does it, or is it a forum post? Where do I put it?
Well, I think let's file it as a GitHub issue, and then we can relay it to the forum. Sorry if I cut something.
I think that's the topic I would like to address, which is like, what's the role, what is the best way for us to document all these things and carry on an asynchronous conversation? So I think URL table is definitely a good example of a small, or maybe not small, like both of these are great. To me, these seem like things that should go up on the technical section as independent threads on the forum.
Yeah.
Personally, and I think that begins kind of a broader, maybe broader, maybe not, but the conversation of like, how do we get more asynchronous work happening in general, and allow the community to invite the community to self-organize, more sophisticated conversation around, things like tables and changes, schedule those two items,
right,
around things like taxonomy, around things like taxonomy, etc.
Yeah,
because I don't see it. I think we could do better than what we're currently doing. Although we're doing okay now. I mean, there is some activity on the forum, but.
So I think first there's like maybe a procedural question that I look to you all for guidance on, which is like, are we encouraging people to bring issues to GitHub and then talk about them in the forum, because you could talk about them in the GitHub issues. Like do we have a sort of default first place for if there's like something technical that you want to see addressed in the spec, recognizing that there's some redundancy between these two different places. If you all have experience with other communities, what's worked well or what you think could work better, you know, we can set some norms around this. So,
I mean, I think the GitHub is for technically specific bugs and for the work of codification, basically, and that everything else is a forum post.
Okay.
So if there's like an obvious error in the GitHub,
right,
you know, you bring it up there, but everything else is people should be encouraged to discuss in the forum, and the forum should really become a knowledge base.
Yeah.
Where people are like, oh, the scheduling issue. You know, I'm going to search you know, like the forum software will surface like, oh, are you writing a post about scheduling? Someone else, you know, there are these topics that maybe you should contribute to instead. So I think that's the short answer.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
I think the higher level, more strategic conversation around this sits in the forum, and then the actual, you know, implementation or whatever comes of that lives in GitHub. Is the way I see it.
Okay, great. So Skylar, on both of these issues sounds good, but bring them back to the forum if you haven't yet.
Okay.
So let me look ahead to the summit, give you all a sneak preview, and then we can potentially have a few minutes to start the conversation that Devin had on your mind about the taxonomy, which I think potentially feeds into the summit agenda. So what's shaping up right now, we have a couple of days, 4 hours each. It looks like we're going to have about like somewhere between 20 and 30 people. There's probably about 5 people who are telling me I can't make the whole time and I'll pop in and out, which I'm generally discouraging. But in some cases, it's better than nothing. Certainly with David. David, we were able to bump it up an hour. I don't know if you saw that, so that it's no longer ending at 8 o'clock UK time. It will be ending at 7 o'clock UK. I apologize for the UK folks that it's going to be that late, but that way we're spreading the pain between the West Coast and England. We've got an interesting mix. I'd say it's almost balanced between technical folks and folks who just do the work of resource data management. I think we probably have about 5 to 7 people from 211s across the country coming. And also a couple folks from the National Data Platform will be there. A mix, there's a handful of other smaller vendors that are attending. None of the big vendors asked to join, but you know, maybe we'll be surprised in the last week. Gunnar is in the process of reaching out to everybody and getting input on the agenda, which will take it from like my very long and rambly list of things that I think we'll want to talk about to a much more focused list based on what we're seeing people want to plan to discuss. So responses to Gunnar that's significant input that we will be pouring carefully through. My sense is we'll probably have 3 or 4 different topics running in concurrent blocks, like a technical topic and a strategic topic running in concurrent blocks, and people will direct themselves. And we'll be counting on I think we'll have enough facilitation capacity between Dan and I, and but if there's a topic that you would like to hold space for, that you'd like to hold space for, we can be in touch about that, about whether you might be able to step up as a facilitator. But I think we should be all right on facilitation. And one more note, I think in the first half of the first day, we'll probably once again spend some time doing small group rotations around a set of tables where people will spotlight specific projects. And I'm hoping to have about somewhere between 6 and 8 spotlights across 2 different sessions. So the people sitting at a spotlight will probably miss 3 or 4, about 2 or 3 other spotlighted sessions. But I'll be briefing them to make sure they don't have, terrible FOMO. Skylar will probably want to hear about we might want to hear about the Federation infrastructure, or at least the silo buster work that you've done and where you want to go. And Mike, I think we'll probably want to profile just like maybe maybe UK broadly or the UK profile specifically. Or maybe that'll be like a spotlight on profiling as a mechanism. I'm going to potentially ask the National Data Platform to sit for a spotlight, and some other stuff. If you have suggestions for like initiatives happening out there that you think the whole, the community that's coming to this time like should hear about, I'd welcome that. Any questions? Okay, cool. Very grateful in advance for everybody's time. Even the Open Data Services Co-op, even though I'll be paying for that. But I'm especially grateful for David. If you have time that you're able to allocate on this, that's great of you, because it's no longer part of your job, and I'm thankful for that. And Atticus, I haven't had you on my list, but if you'd like to be in, it'd be great to have you. So let's be sure to follow.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you. I've been meaning to respond to your email, but I was out last week. So
okay.
But I'll bring up that conversation.
Okay, yeah, let's do that sooner than later, because we're trying to bring it all in the next days.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the final. So we have 5 minutes left. Devin, if you had thoughts about starting a taxonomy conversation, that will help me think through the design of the agenda potentially. But I assume that whatever you have on your mind, it's a longer time frame that we'll need. But did you want to share your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think that there's one of the things that spec doesn't have more broadly is a is pick lists. I mean, I think taxonomy starts with pick lists. Right now in the specification, we don't have things like, I don't believe, something changed, things like phone type or, kind of these, if I go through my implementation, my classification fields, I could read off a list of probably 10 different typologies that just, if you're going to implement HSDS, you probably don't want to have to think through, you just don't want to have to think through kind of this level of minutia. Right. Let me read through a few of them. Services, no, here we are. Languages, I know we've got like an ISO approach, so maybe just like actually like bringing this stuff out. Phone types, fee options, service status, I believe, is another one. And in my system, we also have tags, and we document interaction methods, disposition, stuff like that, stuff that isn't necessary for this conversation. But I think basically, even maybe required documentation, it would be nice to offer that, to offer quick start terms. And then I think that also could extend if we wanted to, but in a much more that could extend to service service classifications, and gives us an opportunity to quietly implement a open referral, open eligibility, 1 degree merge of like kind of a recommended, if you don't have service classifications yet, just as you could use our phone types, you could also use this list to start off of. Okay.
So it sounds like you have things on your mind that are actually tangential to the issue of service taxonomy, although I think some of those kinds of categories you would find buried in the 211 taxonomy. and the issue does sort of bleed into the bigger question of the taxonomy. So Devin, let's be sure to get, your suggestions about essentially thinking about like attributes and enumerations and categories. And let's be sure to get that to Gunnar in our notes, and I will see if we want to. Oh, hey there. Hello, little young. We'll see if we can carve out some space for people to put their thinking caps on together next week. But Devin, what I would like to think through is, do you have a way to frame this as a question that you think we could answer in a 45-minute or hour-long dedicated stretch specifically to the topic? Let's think if we might be able to land on specific prompts that are.
Well, I mean, I think the simple one here, which I would also ask the call, is like, should we have enumerations? Should we have a section for like suggested deployment?
Yeah.
Enumerations.
Okay. In
the standard.
I mean, the way we define that in other standards we've done is like open code lists essentially. So you have the base ones, and then then people add, say, like they've got a funny phone type, whatever. But do we have those as part of it? Even if you reduce them or constrain them, do we just have those as part of the standard and aren't? Yeah. Which other standards do have those sort of base open code lists and a list of the set few that you think most people will need?
Yeah, I think that would be I would be happy to frame this as an open code list. And then if we want to, we can add service classifications to it.
Great.
It's not that big of a deal.
Okay, Devin, let's be sure to have that in your feedback to Gunnar if you haven't already. And anybody else, if you have other thoughts on that, let's start a forum discussion. And I am looking forward to see you next week. Please keep me posted if you have any suggestions or questions. Thanks, everybody. Bye.